Florida State Prison. Stark, Florida. A 65-year-old man is being strapped to a gurney in a room that smells like disinfectant and fear. His name is Norman Mearle Grim Jr. He's wearing a standard-issue prison uniform, light blue shirt, dark blue pants. His gray hair is thin. His face shows every one of his 65 years. The execution chamber is smaller than you'd think. Sterile. Clinical. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. There's a one-way mirror where witnesses sit. Victims' families, lawyers, journalists, a handful of others who requested to be here. They can see in. Norman can't see them. 2 4-lines snake into his arms. One in each. Backup protocol. Florida doesn't take chances. The warden stands nearby with a microphone. He's done this before. 14 times already this year, actually. Norman will be number 15. A state record. Mr. Grimm, do you have any final words? Norman turns his head slightly, looks at the warden. His voice is steady. No, sir. That's it. 2 words. After 27 years on death row, after a brutal murder that shocked Florida, after all the appeals and motions and legal fights, 2 words. The warden nods. He signals to the executioner behind a separate partition. You can't see that person. You never can. 6:14 p.m. Norman Mearle Grim Jr. is pronounced dead. Florida's 15th execution of 2025. The most in state history. More than Texas. More than Alabama. Florida leads the nation this year. But here's the question that haunts this case. When we execute a man with documented mental illness, a decorated Navy veteran with diagnoses of intermittent explosive disorder, depression, and antisocial personality disorder, are we administering justice? Or are we just killing someone the system failed to fix? Because the evidence against Norman was overwhelming. There's no question he did it. The DNA, the blood, the physical evidence, it all pointed to him. He killed his neighbor, Cynthia Campbell, in a way that was brutal and senseless. But Norman's lawyers wanted to argue mental illness. They wanted to present expert testimony about his disorders, his abusive childhood, his medication compliance problems. Norman told them no. He said he'd rather die than spend life in prison. He waived his own defense, so the jury never heard most of it. And now he's dead. Earlier that day, Norman ate his last meal. Fried pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, Brussels sprouts, banana cream pie, a chocolate milkshake, soda. Simple food. Comfort food. The kind of meal someone's grandmother might make. He woke up at 6 a.m., declined visitors, declined a spiritual advisor, spent his last hours alone in a cell waiting. Some people say he got what he deserved. Others say we executed a sick man who needed treatment, not death. Both things can be true at the same time. That's what makes this case so hard. Before we go any further, if you're finding value in this story, please take a second to like and subscribe. Your support helps us tell these important, difficult stories that need to be told. And drop a comment. What time is it where you are, and what state are you watching from? We love hearing from you. This story doesn't begin in that sterile execution chamber. It begins on a summer morning in 1998, in a quiet neighborhood near Pensacola. With broken glass scattered across a driveway, a 911 call, and an invitation for coffee that would end 2 lives, one immediately, one 27 years later. Cynthia Campbell was 41 years old, an attorney, single, lived alone in a modest house in Santa Rosa County. She specialized in helping underdogs, people fighting contractors and developers who had more money and more lawyers. She'd recently received death threats, credible ones, from people she was opposing in court. She told her secretary, "If I ever end up dead in the Bay, point your finger at Henry Company Homes." The Bay? Pensacola Bay. That's exactly where her body was found. But it wasn't the contractor who killed her. It was her neighbor, the guy who lived next door, the one who seemed concerned when her window got broken at 5 a.m. that morning, the one who invited her over for coffee while the deputies were still there taking her report. She said yes. Norman Grimm had been on parole. He had a violent criminal history from 1982. Kidnappings, assaults, attempted child abduction. He'd served 9 years. Got out. Worked in manufacturing. His coworkers described him as reliable, punctual, hardworking. But under stress, he made what one psychological evaluation called appalling errors of judgment. July 27, 1998 was one of those days. To understand how a decorated veteran who once supervised teams and earned excellent performance reviews ended up strapped to that gurney 27 years later, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to a childhood that broke him, and a system that never quite put him back together. Norman Mearle Grim Jr. was born into chaos. His father was an alcoholic, distant, mean when he drank, which was often. His childhood home wasn't a home. It was a place where bad things happened and nobody talked about them. The details are sparse. Court records mention abuse and neglect. Psychological evaluations reference chaotic family environment and inadequate parenting. But those clinical terms don't capture what it's like to grow up in a house where you're not safe. Norman learned early that the world was violent, that people hurt you, that you couldn't trust anyone to protect you. But here's the thing about Norman. He didn't stay there. At some point, he joined the U.S. Navy, served honorably. That's in his record. Honorable discharge. For a kid from a broken home, the military gave him something he'd never had: structure, rules, a sense of purpose. His Navy service was a point of pride for him. Even decades later, even on death row, he still identified as a veteran. After the Navy, he got a job in manufacturing. And he was good at it. Really good. His coworkers described him as punctual, dependable, hardworking. His performance reviews? Good to excellent. He supervised teams. People relied on him. He showed up. He did the work. This is important, because it means Norman wasn't always broken. Or at least, he was functional. He could hold down a job. He could maintain relationships with coworkers. He could follow rules and meet expectations. So what happened? Norman is 22 years old. One day in Pensacola, something snaps. He kidnaps a woman. She escapes by stealing his car. He breaks into 2 homes, injures a resident in one before getting chased off. He tries to abduct a 14-year-old girl. Bystanders intervene and stop him. All of this happens in one day. A single crime spree. He's arrested, convicted of violent felonies, sentenced to prison. This is when the system first documents what's wrong with Norman. Intermittent explosive disorder. Episodes of extreme, disproportionate rage. Impulsive aggression that comes out of nowhere. Depressive disorder. Chronic low mood. Hopelessness. The kind that makes everything feel impossible. Antisocial personality disorder. Difficulty with empathy. Rule breaking. A disconnect between actions and consequences. A psychologist evaluates him. Notes that Norman, under stress, exhibits appalling errors of judgment. That phrase shows up in his file. Appalling errors of judgment. It's clinical language for, when things get hard, this man becomes dangerous. He serves 9 years. Gets prescribed Prozac for depression. Depakote for mood stabilization. Then he's released. By the mid-1990s, Norman is out on parole. Back in Pensacola. Back to his manufacturing job. For a while, things seem okay. But medication compliance is inconsistent. Mental health treatment for parolees isn't exactly robust. You're supposed to check in with a parole officer. You're supposed to take your meds. You're supposed to stay out of trouble. But nobody's really watching. And by 1998, Norman is going through a divorce. That's a stressor. A big one. His mental health is deteriorating. Whether he's taking his medication regularly, unclear. What is clear, he's isolated. Stressed. Unraveling. He's living alone in a house in Santa Rosa County, right next door to a woman named Cynthia Campbell. So here's the question that haunts this case. Was Norman Grim a monster waiting to emerge? Or was he a damaged man the system recycled without healing? Because both things can be true. Yes, he had documented mental illness. Yes, he came from severe childhood trauma. Yes, the system diagnosed him, medicated him, then released him without adequate follow-up. But also, he made choices. In 1982, he chose to commit violent crimes against multiple people in a single day. In 1998, he chose to commit an even worse crime. Mental illness explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. And that's the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Norman wasn't some cartoon villain. He wasn't born evil. He had moments of functioning, of normalcy, of actual competence. But he was also violent. Repeatedly. And the warning signs were documented. They were right there in his file. Intermittent explosive disorder. Check. History of impulsive violence. Check. Inconsistent treatment compliance. Check. High-stress life circumstances. Check. All the ingredients were there. And nobody intervened. Not because they didn't know. They knew. It's in the records. The diagnoses. The psych evaluations. The parole reports. But knowing and acting are different things. So Norman Grim lived next door to Cynthia Campbell, a woman who prosecuted contractors, a woman who worked alone, lived alone, and had recently received death threats that scared her enough to mention them to her secretary. And on July 27, 1998, everything Norman had been, the abused kid, the honorable veteran, the reliable worker, the violent offender, the mentally ill man without adequate treatment, all of it converged in a single morning. By that summer, Norman was on a collision course with tragedy. The only question was when, and who would get hurt. Cynthia Campbell was 41 years old when she died. She was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Grew up wanting to help people. That's what her parents, Ralph and Dorothea Campbell, said about her later. Their only daughter. The one who always wanted to help the underdog. Her first plan was nursing. She wanted to care for people directly. Physical care. But a shoulder injury ended that path before it really started. So she pivoted. Went to law school instead. By 1998, she was a solo practitioner in Pensacola, Florida. No big firm. No corporate clients. She represented regular people in civil litigation, usually against contractors and developers who had more money and more lawyers than her clients did. She took on cases other attorneys wouldn't touch. The ones that weren't profitable. The ones where you're going up against established companies with deep pockets. She wasn't doing it for the money. You don't become a solo practitioner taking on construction disputes because you want to get rich. She was doing it because someone had to. Cynthia was single. Lived alone in a modest house in Santa Rosa County, just outside Pensacola. She worked long hours. Kept files at home. Met clients at odd times because that's when they were available. People who knew her said she was dedicated. Fearless in court. The kind of attorney who wouldn't back down. But she wasn't fearless in private. In the weeks before she died, Cynthia was scared. She was involved in multiple lawsuits against a contractor called Henry Holmes. One case was for a client named Charles Worrell. At a contentious meeting at one of the company's properties, someone, either an employee or representative of Henry Holmes, made a threat. The exact words, according to testimony, Cynthia was putting her nose where it didn't belong and might find herself dead in the bay. The bay? Pensacola Bay. Cynthia took the threat seriously. She told her secretary about it. She told Charles Worrell. She was shaken. She even said this explicitly, "If I ever end up dead in the bay, point your finger at Henry Company Homes." That's not the kind of thing you say lightly. That's real fear. She considered withdrawing from the case. Her voice trembled when she talked about it. But she didn't withdraw. She kept working. Because that's who Cynthia was. Even when she was scared, she kept showing up. Her parents would later describe her in court as someone who helped people who couldn't help themselves. Someone who stood up when it was hard. She deserved a long life. A career filled with victories for her clients. Maybe eventually a family of her own. She deserved to grow old. It starts at 5 a.m. Cynthia wakes up to the sound of breaking glass. Someone threw a lug nut through her window. A tree branch hit her car. She doesn't know who. She doesn't know why. She calls 911. Deputies respond. They find Norman Grim outside her house. He lives next door. He tells them his dogs were barking, so he came out to investigate. The deputies take a report. They're wrapping up. And then Norman invites Cynthia over for coffee. She says no the first time. He asks again. The deputy is still there. It's broad daylight. Her neighbor is offering a kind gesture after a scary incident. She says yes. The deputies leave. Cynthia walks next door. What happens inside Norman Grim's house is reconstructed from forensic evidence, because Cynthia can't tell us what happened. And Norman never gave details. But the physical evidence speaks. Cynthia was beaten with a claw hammer. 18 separate blunt force injuries to her head. Her skull fractured. She fought back. There are defensive wounds on her left hand. She tried to protect herself. But Norman was stronger. 11 stab wounds to her chest. 7 of them penetrated her heart. Medical examiners also found a large vaginal laceration. Sexual battery. He raped her either during or after the attack. Then he wrapped her body. A sheet from his house. A piece of rug that matched scraps from his parent home. Rope. Masking tape. Plastic garbage bags. He carried her to his car. Put her in the trunk. Drove to a nearby fishing bridge over Pensacola Bay. And dumped her body into the water. The same bay she'd been warned about weeks earlier. By 9 a.m., people start to worry. Cynthia was supposed to meet her bookkeeper at 7:30 a.m. Didn't show up. She was supposed to meet her new paralegal at 8 a.m. Didn't show up. That wasn't like her. Cynthia was responsible. Punctual. Deputies returned to her house. They questioned Norman again. He consents to a search of his home. At first, nothing obvious. No blood pools. No signs of struggle. But there are subtle things. A pinkish stain on his shoulder. He says it's paint primer. Reddish-brown spots on his shorts. A tan line on his wrist where a watch should be, but no watch. A gate that looks freshly forced. Norman claims he doesn't have a key to his car trunk. While the deputies are deliberating, Norman's dogs escape. Or he lets them escape. He drives off, supposedly to chase them. Around 1 p.m., someone spots him near the fishing bridge. His trunk is open. He sees them looking. Drives away fast. 3 p.m. A fisherman is casting lines off the bridge. His hook snags something heavy in the water. He reels it up. It's Cynthia. By the time investigators execute a search warrant on Norman's house, the evidence is overwhelming. Traces of Cynthia's blood in his kitchen and dining room. A cooler containing bloodied sheets. The claw hammer. Her glasses. A watch with a torn band. Her fingerprints on a coffee cup in his kitchen. DNA evidence linking Norman to the sexual assault. All the wrapping materials, the sheet, the rug, the rope, the tape, the bags, match items found in or connected to his home. He invited her in for coffee. She came in. He killed her. Here's the terrible irony. Cynthia had been warning people for weeks that she might end up dead in Pensacola Bay. She thought it would be the contractors she was fighting in court. The people with money and power who wanted her to stop. But her worst fear came true in a different way. Not at the hands of those she opposed in court. At the hands of her neighbor. The guy who offered comfort on her doorstep. The one she trusted enough to accept coffee from while the police were still there. Norman Grim killed Cynthia Campbell that morning. Brutally. Senselessly. And then he tried to run. Within hours of finding Cynthia's body, investigators knew who did it. Not because of brilliant detective work. Not because of some breakthrough forensic technique. Because Norman Grim made it obvious. When deputies first returned to Cynthia's house that morning, after she missed her appointments, they talked to Norman again. He lived right next door. He'd been there when they responded to the broken window call. They asked if they could search his house. He said yes. That's important. He consented. No warrant needed at that point. At first glance, nothing jumped out. No blood pools. No body. No signs of obvious struggle. But investigators noticed small things. A pinkish stain on Norman's shoulder. He said it was paint primer. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Reddish-brown spots on his shorts. Could be anything. Could be blood. A tan line on his wrist where a watch should be. But no watch. A gate that looked like it had been forced open recently. And when they asked about his car trunk, Norman said he didn't have a key to it. Who doesn't have a key to their own trunk? While deputies were still processing all this, Norman's dogs got loose. Or he let them loose. Either way, Norman used it as an excuse to get in his car and drive off. Said he was going to find his dogs. Deputies let him go. At that point, they didn't have enough to hold him. But they were watching. Around 1 p.m., someone spotted Norman near a fishing bridge over Pensacola Bay. The trunk of his car was open. When he saw them looking, he closed it fast and drove away. That's when deputies knew. They didn't have proof yet, but they knew. At 3 p.m., a fisherman snagged Cynthia's body, wrapped in materials, weighted down, dumped in the bay. Now it was a homicide investigation. Investigators got a search warrant for Norman's house, and when they executed it, the evidence was everywhere. Cynthia's blood, in the kitchen, in the dining room. Trace amounts, but enough. DNA confirmed. A cooler in his house. Inside, bloodied sheets. The murder weapon. A claw hammer. Blood on it. Cynthia's personal belongings. Her glasses. A watch with a torn band, the one she'd been wearing. Her fingerprints. On a coffee cup in Norman's kitchen. Proof that she'd been there, just like he said when he invited her over. Wrapping materials. The sheet wrapped around Cynthia's body matched sheets from Norman's house. The rug matched scraps found at his parent home. The rope, the masking tape, the garbage bags, all traced back to Norman. DNA evidence. Norman's DNA was recovered from Cynthia's body. Sexual assault confirmed by medical examiner. DNA doesn't lie. The evidence didn't whisper Norman's guilt. It screamed. But by the time investigators had all this evidence, Norman was gone. He fled west, drove across state lines, became a fugitive. For 4 days, there was a nationwide manhunt. Police in multiple states looking for him. His photo distributed. Be on the lookout for this man. Armed and dangerous. On July 31st, 1998, 4 days after Cynthia's murder, police found Norman in Watonga, Oklahoma, at his father's house. He surrendered peacefully, didn't resist arrest, didn't fight. Here's what made the case so strong. Physical evidence. Blood, DNA, fingerprints, wrapping materials, murder weapon, victim's belongings. Every single piece pointed to Norman. Timeline. Cynthia was last seen alive going into Norman's house. Her body was found hours later. Norman was spotted at the bridge where the body was dumped. He fled immediately after. Forensics. DNA matched. Blood matched. Materials matched. Medical examiner confirmed cause of death, sexual assault, defensive wounds. Witness accounts. Deputies saw Norman at the scene that morning. Saw him invite Cynthia over. Saw him acting suspicious during the search. Saw him flee. There was no alternate theory that made sense. No other suspect. No reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys would later try to introduce the Henry Holmes threats, the contractor who'd warned Cynthia she might end up dead in the bay. But the judge ruled those statements inadmissible hearsay. And even if they'd been admitted, the physical evidence still pointed overwhelmingly to Norman. This wasn't a mystery. It was a man who killed his neighbor, tried to cover it up, and left evidence everywhere. Investigators built the case methodically. Blood evidence, DNA, fingerprints, wrapping materials, weapon, victim's belongings, witness testimony. Each piece alone might not convict, but together, airtight. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and charged Norman Mearle Grim Jr. with first-degree murder and sexual battery with a weapon. On August 26, 1998, exactly 1 month after Cynthia's murder, a grand jury indicted him. The state was seeking the death penalty, and with evidence this strong, they were confident they'd get it. August 26, 1998, 1 month after Cynthia Campbell's murder, a grand jury indicts Norman Mearle Grim Jr. on 2 charges. First-degree murder, sexual battery with a weapon. The state of Florida announces it will seek the death penalty. The trial doesn't start for another 2 years. October 27, 2000. Santa Rosa County Circuit Court. Judge Kenneth Bell presiding. Norman is 40 years old now. He's been in custody for over 2 years, and from the very beginning, he makes something clear to his attorneys. He doesn't want mitigation evidence presented. He'd rather die than spend the rest of his life in prison. His lawyers try to talk him out of it. That's their job. But Norman won't budge. This is important because it shapes everything that follows. The prosecution's case is straightforward. They present the physical evidence methodically. Blood spatter analysis. Cynthia's blood in Norman's kitchen and dining room. DNA evidence. Norman's DNA recovered from Cynthia's body. The wrapping materials. Sheet, rug, rope, tape bags, all matched to Norman's home. The murder weapon. Claw hammer with blood evidence. Cynthia's belongings. Her glasses. Her watch. Found in Norman's house. Her fingerprints on a coffee cup in his kitchen. Proof she was there. Witness testimony. The deputies who saw Norman at the scene. The fishermen who found the body. Forensic experts who analyzed the evidence. The defense tries a few things. They attempt to introduce Cynthia's death threats from the Henry Holmes contractor. The ones where she'd said, "If I end up dead in the bay, point your finger at Henry Company Homes." The judge rules it inadmissible hearsay. They try to suggest alternative suspects, but the physical evidence doesn't support it. Everything points to Norman. The jury deliberates. They return with a verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. Guilty. Sexual battery with a weapon. Both counts. Unanimous. Norman shows no reaction. Just sits there. The penalty phase. This is where the jury decides life in prison or death. The prosecution presents 3 aggravating factors. Norman was on parole when he committed this crime. He'd been released from prison for his 1982 violent offenses. He did this while under supervision. He had prior convictions for violent felonies. The 1982 crime spree, kidnappings, assaults, attempted child abduction. The murder was committed during a sexual battery. He raped Cynthia Campbell. Then he killed her. The defense presents nothing because Norman won't let them. He's waived his right to present mitigation evidence. He's told his lawyers he wants the death penalty. So the jury hears only the prosecution's case. They deliberate. They return with a recommendation. But Florida law requires something called a Spencer hearing before the judge can impose a death sentence. It's a chance for the court to hear mitigation evidence, even if the defendant doesn't want to present it. Special counsel is appointed over Norman's objections, and they bring in testimony about his life, his abusive childhood, alcoholic father, neglect, violence in the home. The judge gives this significant weight. His mental disorders, intermittent explosive disorder, depression, antisocial personality disorder, documented and diagnosed. The judge gives this great weight. His work ethic, years of solid employment, punctual, dependable, hardworking, co-workers who respected him. The judge gives this significant weight. His marital stress in 1998, divorce, isolation, mental health deteriorating. The judge gives this great weight. His potential as a model inmate, arguments that he could serve life without causing problems. The judge gives this some weight. But here's where it gets complicated. The defense wants the court to find statutory mental health mitigators. Things like extreme emotional disturbance or substantially impaired capacity. The judge says no. He rules those mitigators weren't sufficiently established. Why? Because Norman refused to let his lawyers present expert witnesses, psychiatrists, psychologists, people who could have testified in detail about his mental state. Without that expert testimony, the court says the statutory mitigators don't apply. November 7, 2000. Judge Kenneth Bell sentences Norman Mearle Grim Jr. Death for the murder of Cynthia Campbell. 32 years for sexual battery. The judge's words from the bench: the crime was savagely brutal and senseless. He finds that the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigating factors. Norman shows no reaction. Here's the question that haunts this case. Could more expert testimony about Norman's mental state have changed the outcome? We'll never know. Because Norman refused to let his lawyers try. He wanted to die. From the moment he was arrested, he made that clear. Death over life in prison. The legal system tried to save him from himself. Appointed special counsel. Held a Spencer hearing. considered mitigation evidence. But there's only so much the system can do when the defendant is actively working against his own defense. Some people say this proves Norman knew exactly what he did, that he had enough mental capacity to understand and accept the consequences. Others say this proves he was too mentally ill to make rational decisions about his own defense, that the system should have intervened more forcefully. Both arguments have merit. Norman spent the next 25 years on death row at Florida State Prison near Stark, and the appeals process began. In Florida, death penalty cases automatically go to the state Supreme Court. Norman's case, Florida Supreme Court Case SC-01-256, centered on three main arguments. First, the jury recommended death without hearing any mitigation evidence. Then the judge weighed that recommendation heavily, even though special counsel later introduced mitigation at the Spencer hearing. Was that fair? Second, Norman's lawyers didn't call expert witnesses about his mental health. Psychiatrists, psychologists, people who could have explained his disorders in detail. The defense said this was ineffective assistance of counsel. Third, the judge excluded Cynthia's statements about the contractor threats, the ones where she said if she ended up dead in the bay, blame Henry Holmes. The defense argued this violated Norman's constitutional right to present alternative suspects. The Florida Supreme Court denied all of it. And over the next 25 years, every other appeal failed too. Post-conviction relief petitions, federal habeas corpus, constitutional challenges. Nothing worked. Norman spent a quarter-century on death row at Florida State Prison near Stark. Q-wing, death row housing, 6x9 cell, 23 hours a day inside. We don't know much about his life there. Whether he made friends, whether he changed, whether he ever expressed remorse. What we do know, he never wavered on wanting to die. 2025. Governor Ron DeSantis' administration accelerates Florida's execution schedule. By October, Florida has already executed 14 people. More than Texas. More than Alabama. Florida leads the nation. Norman's death warrant is signed. He could appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. He could file for clemency with the governor. These are his rights. He waives them. All of them. After 27 years on death row, Norman Grimm seemed almost eager for it to end. October 28, 2025. Execution Day. Norman wakes up at 6 a.m. He's offered a chance to have visitors, family members, friends, a spiritual advisor. He declines. All of it. He spends his final hours alone. Around midday, he's asked about his last meal. In Florida, it's not elaborate. Nothing expensive. But you can request certain foods. Norman asks for fried pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, Brussels sprouts, banana cream pie, a chocolate milkshake, soda. It's the kind of meal your grandmother might make. Comfort food. Simple. He eats it in his cell. Afternoon passes. The clock ticks. Around 5 p.m., he's moved to a holding cell near the execution chamber. He's offered a chance to write a final statement, something to be read later. He doesn't. He's offered a chance to speak to someone, a chaplain, anyone. He says no. At 6 p.m., corrections officers escort him to the execution chamber. He walks on his own, doesn't resist, doesn't speak. They strap him to the gurney, arms out, legs secured. 2 4 lines, one in each arm. The warden approaches with a microphone. Mr. Grimm, do you have any final words? Norman turns his head, looks at the warden. No, sir. 2 words. After 27 years. The warden nods. The drugs begin to flow. A sedative to render him unconscious. A paralytic to stop his breathing. Potassium chloride to stop his heart. At 6:14 p.m., Norman Mearle Grim Jr. is pronounced dead. Florida's 15th execution of 2025. The drugs flow through the 4 lines. First, the sedative, midazolam. It's supposed to render him unconscious within seconds. Norman's eyes close. His breathing slows. Then the paralytic, vecuronium bromide. It stops his lungs from working. Finally, potassium chloride. It stops his heart. The whole process takes about 10 minutes. At 6:14 p.m., a doctor checks for vital signs. Finds none. Norman Mearle Grim Jr. is pronounced dead. No complications. No drama. Just a man on a gurney who stops breathing. Florida's 15th execution of 2025. A state record. More than Texas. More than Alabama. Florida leads the nation. Behind the glass, witnesses watch. Representatives from the Campbell family are there. Cynthia's parents, Ralph and Dorothea, passed away years ago. But other family members came. They've waited 27 years for this. One of them gives a statement afterward. Justice was finally served. Cynthia can rest now. But does an execution bring rest? Or just finality? Outside the prison, a small group of death penalty opponents holds vigil. They hold signs. Like candles. They point out that Norman was the 5th military veteran executed in Florida in 2025. 5 veterans with documented service. 5 men who wore the uniform. They argue the system overlooked generational trauma. Mental illness. The things that broke these men before they broke others. Social media erupts with the usual debates. Some people say Norman got what he deserved. He raped and murdered his neighbor. The evidence was overwhelming. Death penalty supporters call this justice. Others say we executed a mentally ill man. Someone with documented disorders. Someone who needed treatment, not death. They call it state-sanctioned killing of the broken. Both sides are loud. Neither changes the other's mind. 2025 ends up being a record year for executions nationwide. 41 total. The most since 2010. Florida accounts for 15 of them. The pace raises questions. Are we rushing? Are we being thorough enough? Are we comfortable with this? But those questions don't bring Cynthia Campbell back. And they don't undo what Norman did on July 27, 1998. So what was this? Justice? Maybe. The legal system worked. Evidence was overwhelming. He got a trial. Multiple appeals over 25 years. Due process. Vengeance. Possibly. We killed a man who killed someone else. An eye for an eye. The oldest form of justice. Mercy. Strange as it sounds, maybe. Norman wanted to die. Said so from the beginning. Waived his defenses. Waived his final appeals. After 27 years on death row, death might have been what he wanted most. The execution of Norman Grim Jr. closed the case. But it opened questions. Questions about how we treat veterans with mental illness. Questions about whether documented disorders should change outcomes. Questions about whether killing the broken makes us whole. Questions about what justice actually means. Cynthia Campbell deserved to live. That's not in question. Norman Grim took that from her. Brutally. That's not in question either. What we do in response, that's where it gets complicated. Thank you for engaging with this case. Stories like Norman Grim's and Cynthia Campbell's force us to confront hard truths about our justice system, mental health treatment, and how we respond to violence. These cases don't have easy answers, but they demand that we keep asking the questions. If you believe these stories deserve to be told with depth and dignity, please subscribe and share. Awareness matters. Memory matters. Comment below. Should documented mental illness change sentencing in cases with overwhelming evidence? Let's discuss thoughtfully. Next, we look at a death row case that divided a nation, where innocence claims persisted until the very end.